Whether you need to manage bots, protect cloud applications at runtime, stop form-jacking attacks, or secure your web applications and APIs, only Imperva offers a unified solution to protect from edge to application and data in one tool. Imperva helps you achieve more, save money, and become more efficient with fewer security vendors needed. Start a free trial today to easily protect your apps and website with Imperva. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Imperva. We discuss application security a lot on this show, and we know that the implications for code security have become even greater as cloud adoption accelerates software development. Shift Left bridges the gap between security teams and developers to find and fix vulnerabilities accurately from the source. Shift Left Core is an innovation in code security with industry-leading accuracy and speed. It combines next-generation static code analysis, intelligent software composition analysis, secrets detection, security insights, and contextual developer security education in one easy-to-use platform. Learn more and create your free account at securityweekly.com/shiftleft. Software supply chain attacks are continuing to expose vulnerabilities in organizations around the world. The time has come to focus your efforts on security for your software packages. Cloudsmith is the only cloud-native software package management solution for your enterprise. With Cloudsmith Continuous Packaging, you can securely deliver software across the globe and mitigate potential threats from entering your supply chain. With over 23+ formats supported, Cloudsmith is the solution that engineers choose to safely deliver all of their assets. Reduce unneeded downtime and deliver with confidence. Start securing your software supply chain today by visiting securityweekly.com/cloudsmith.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, a Discord server. You can be chatting with us live right now, and you can also follow us on social media and our other streaming platforms. Additionally, Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake, Buena Vista. We'll have keynotes from Alyssa Miller, John Strand, Leslie Carhart, and Dave Kennedy. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to register, please, and check out our exciting lineup. John, this brings us to the news segment now. It's also November 1st, so I did want to point out that it is Samhain. The festival that everyone sees written down, but nobody knows how to pronounce. But it's also when the boundary between worlds is very thin, much like the boundary between AppSec and DevOps should be very thin. But in the last segment, as we heard from Peter, one of the ways to make that boundary thin is to find engineering principles like better observability that are helpful to engineering teams, to DevOps teams, that can also then have some security principles or some security properties then tagged onto them. So I know I'm making this up as we go, but I'm not sure if there's a particular boundary between AppSec and DevOps that you would love to see broken down.
I'm going to go in the opposite direction on that one and say I think we're getting too close, at least in some cases. By which I mean when people embrace DevOps and embrace IAC in particular, the idea of having one stack where everything is put together isn't necessarily a good idea. I've got a few blog posts I'm working on that are going to come out in coming weeks. Mostly around the idea of when we see code examples out there, like on, let's pick a company that I don't know. We were talking about OPA, so let's look at OPA. Probably not the best example, but I'm going to run with it. Some of the code examples we see out there don't actually include errors in them, or how to do error handling properly. So that's sort of one of the blog posts. But to bring it back to this a little bit, the concept of just because we can do everything in a monolith in a single, say, CDK or Terraform or pick your IAC, doesn't mean it's a good thing. Example being, if you've got a single IAC, which, it brings up your databases, sets up your authentication, sets up your SSL or TLS and your gateways, your API gateways, and deploys your Lambdas and does all everything's perfectly and it works great. What I've seen over the weekend is there could be situations where that stack gets into an unrecoverable error, and all of a sudden you have to actually roll back completely, including rolling back your database. Luckily, I'm not doing this in prod yet, but the thought occurred to me, I'm like, that's scary as all get out. And I know my co-founder listens to this, say, hey, Chad, I know you're not getting enough of my voice, so here's more of my voice. But that's something to stop and think about, right? So it sounds like a great idea to us at first, let's put everything together. But maybe sometimes we need to sort of go, okay, let's have an actual infrastructure part and a code part. And that'll probably allow quicker deploys too and things like that. But so I think that's just my general response to your off the cuff question there is maybe not necessarily break down barriers, but sometimes we need to think about what we should or shouldn't be doing. And should we be going for a single state of perfection? How about that? Or should we maybe have something a little more tiered?
There we go. No, and we'll look forward to those blog posts. So definitely let us know. And if they come out before one of our episodes, drop them into the Discord channel for everybody to take a peek. Because it definitely sounds like we're going to have to celebrate the AppSec DevOps equinox is the direction you're going. The other direction we're going, Mr. Kinsella, is seeing some of the same articles. It's interesting, what stands out to each of us as we go and explore what's happened in the week in application security. And one of the things that caught both of our eyes, obviously, was this concept of the minimum viable secure product that Google, Salesforce, a couple other companies are just trying to put together. What does a checklist look like? And it's a bit of a combination between a checklist of a broad instruction of, have some good business processes, but they don't necessarily say exactly the details of what the processes are, how to implement them. But then it does get into some things like password policies, some very prescriptive and detailed recommendations. So I want to throw back to you. Tell us a bit more about why this MVSP stood out for you.
Thank you. You talked just long enough to let a really noisy truck go by outside. I appreciate that. And so do our listeners. So MVSP, Minimum Viable Security Product. This came out last week. It was on both our radars. It's a combination, it's a result of a combination of several companies working together, Google, Salesforce, Okta. It looks like it was based off something from, I think, Dropbox. But end of the day, here's what they're trying to do. I'm a large company. That means, imagine I'm a large company. That means I've got not a lawyer, but not a room, probably a floor filled with lawyers, right? Just in the purchasing department alone that are wanted. And they usually, for them to be working efficiently, they're probably going to want to work with another large enterprise that also has a team of lawyers. And then they know each other, their language they're speaking and all that type of thing. But these companies, hey, they used to be small at some point. They'd love to work with the smaller companies, but they still need to have some level of, how would I say, controls and regulations around what that engagement looks like. So if you want to purchase, if you're Google and you want to buy something or use a product from a small startup, how do you know what they've done for security? We'll focus on security for right now, but that's sort of the idea, right? So what they did is a few of these guys got together and they came up with this thing called a minimum viable security product. So what do you need in that product that at a minimum for a company like that to purchase and use? It is 4 parts. It's split across business, application design controls, application implementation controls, and operational controls. So it's fairly short. They made some interesting choices. I think is what caught my eye about it. So at first, if people go to the show notes, you'll see my snarky comment of another checklist, which it sort of is. But again, like I said, interesting choices in here. 2 caught my eye. One was the password policy. So let's see, what do we have? Well, first they want to support SSO, which is interesting. I mean, definitely something that's needed, right? When you go work with larger enterprise, you have to support SSO, but calling that out was interesting. How the passwords are stored and some of the details around it, requiring email verification for password change. Don't use secret questions as a sole requirement for resetting a password. Password length, characters in the password. So it's interesting to see that was something that they cared enough, particularly that part of AppSec or security in general, to call that out in that much detail. And then the other one in here somewhere, under incident handling. Notify your customers about a breach without undue delay, no later than 72 hours upon discovery. That's quick. So I mean, that's, everyone nods and smiles and will agree with this, but in real life, what will come back to, and I think the interesting part is, are there teeth about if something is, if there's a breach in this? This isn't. I don't think this is a license. This is a license. It's not a contract. So I'm not sure what happens if there's a material breach of this. Like if it takes longer, what actually happens? I think it's just supposed to be these are what we want you to see you have. Because part of the question then comes, well, is it from the time you knew about it till the time it happened? Or, I mean, I think a lot of places, even once they know about it, they can't get a list of people to contact together in 72 hours. So that one's sort of interesting. But that's the overall thing. A lot of people have been talking about over the last week. Surprisingly so to me. I've mentioned to a few folks, and I expect to have to explain it to them. They're like, oh, yeah, we saw it. So, once you put Google and Salesforce on the top of something, it sort of gets out to people pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think, for example, some of like that 72 hours can also actually come from GDPR, which I believe does actually have 72 hours. I can't quite remember the CCPA, California's version of data protection, but there are some external requirements that come in there that do force about what is a breach and have you notified users of a breach, unauthorized access of their data in a timely manner. And I think for me that stood out from this is the idea that we can either go sort of that vendor security checklist, send someone like Cloud Security Alliance has, I think, a multi-dozen questionnaire for this, and they also have the light version that I think is maybe only 1 or 2 dozen questions, but that's sort of saying, are you doing this? And this checklist is coming from, just go ahead and set up your application this way, or design your application this way and operate it in this manner. Mm-hmm. And the things that stand out to me are, it does mention HTTPS only, which it's unfortunate that has to be, that actually has to be commented on in this day and age, rather than it's just assumed as a baseline. And that's where I hope that SSO angle is going as well, because from an enterprise perspective, rather than worrying about the password policy for all of these, this constellation of SaaS applications in use by your org, you just have your own SSO backed by your FIDO key. For those of you who are listening in to the one word that I was repeating every single episode all of last month, those are great protections. And I think the other thing that stood out to me that I would also just kind of 2 things. I lie. Security libraries. It is nice to see just that push towards frameworks, ORMs, UI frameworks, to get rid of SQL injection, cross-site scripting, for example. They're talking about using things like React, Ember.js, or things that make it really hard to introduce vulnerabilities. And the encryption. What it doesn't call out on the encryption part that I would kind of emphasize here is, how do you handle encryption for your customers? Meaning, are you offering customer managed keys? How, is your encryption all or nothing? Does it actually support multi-tenancy out of the box? And does it have different designs, different controls, or just different threat models around the multi-tenancy aspect there? So again, it's a great thing to start with. Would love to see, I would have a couple tweaks here and there perhaps, but basically, if my vendor security questionnaire could be, do you adhere to the MVSP? That's much easier than going through the CSA. Not to pick on them, it's a great checklist, but trying to go through a few hundred questions of a vendor security questionnaire.
Totally. And I think, remember also this, at least the way I'm thinking of this, working with a lot of small startups, I've tried to put together a list of like, how does a small startup, here's the things you need to worry about. But I think this is a really great job of it, right? Like, I mean, if you go to your average 50-person startup and say, show me your data flow diagram, no, ain't going to happen. But that's a super important thing, not just have externally, but it's going to help you internally, new people onboarding, all sorts of things. The one you just mentioned was interesting to me, the using a ORM. And I think with that one, I was going with the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law, because I've been bitten by ORMs in the past, so I don't like them. So when I can, I don't use them. But I will use, and again, this is me saying this, not your average person, right? Average developer. What I will do is use a SQL library and make sure all my queries are using parameterized, they're parameterized queries, and things like that. So there's other ways you can do the same type of thing without using an ORM. But I think this is one of those things if you're able to show a case for that, it's the spirit of the law, not the letter. But yeah, it's a fun thing for folks to read.
No, wonderful point. And now I'm going to have to start introducing you as John Kinsella, not your average person. So thank you for that soundbite. I appreciate it. What we will is, speaking of sort of ORM, Ruby is one that comes to mind in that, and how they handle, active record, making SQL injection more difficult, hopefully impossible, but also some Ruby code. This is my segue into another one of our articles that's a completely different direction in Discourse server. They're using the Amazon's SNS, using a webhook for that basically is just a few lines of code, which is where this researcher was looking at to explore and discover vulnerability. And these few lines of code are basically saying, here is some arguments to pass into a webhook. They need to be signed, and they're going into an open function that is intended to receive the URL, whatever your webhook has subscribed to, something like that. But open, as as many developers know, can also open file handlers and do things like pipe into commands, which leads to remote command execution. And what was really neat about this is that it's one of those articles that it's fun to read through, because you see a researcher who has an idea. They see a code. The code doesn't necessarily have a code smell to it. So it's not, at first glance, clearly insecure, but it's more of, how might I pull this apart? And they walk through about what checks were in place to verify signatures of how these requests are supposed to come in. It's looking and seeing how PEM files, the certificates essentially, are being retrieved, and where are some areas that could drop one of these certs into an AWS environment so that they could actually have some arbitrary signing and to get some arbitrary command execution. So really fun journey. And one of those things that is actually using some cloud native SIS services in probably a very good way. They just sort of made a few fundamental mistakes. So maybe this is also one of those areas where we do need some AppSec to be separated, have a bit of a stronger boundary between AppSec and DevOps. So we have some good AppSec threat modeling and some poking around, if you will, to use the technical terms of these types of environments. And that's how I was trying to tie it back to your initial comments there, John. So not sure if there's something else about this that maybe I missed or that you'd like to highlight. So what did you think of this SNS discourse?
Yeah, no, I think so there's the first part is I made noises. When some of us look at that open, where's the actual line? Open. Oh God, it's so far up. Subscribe URL, and you think about what that's actually doing. Like, oh, that's bad. But what's actually interesting around this to me is, again, it's one of those areas I don't think we spend enough time focusing on, but actually showing people how do you. It's one thing to say, just, filter the input or make sure you're validating what you're handling. And there's libraries do that and things like blah, 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 blah. Hand wave, move on. How often are we actually doing this type of thing, right? So I think at least in Go, and I think probably in most languages, slightly different degree, but like the amount of actual, your LSC count, the line of code, which are just purely doing business logic, probably not that great, right? In this case, dude wants to open a URL. Okay, to send a message, but the number of lines of code you have to do before that somewhere, that sort of pollute if you're just looking at it in one screen, of doing either validation or some sort of cleaning or making sure that's legit. It takes up more work than the actual work you try to do itself. And I think it's good so when I saw that in here, that actually really caught my attention. It's like, okay, cool. This is what people need to see. You need to verify HTTPS, where it's posted from, look at the PEM. And going through and doing all these type of things, I think that's sort of the important part of this. So really great from that point of view. When you were talking through, what I'm sort of thinking about in things like this, it'd be a neat experiment for users, for our listeners. They're not users, they're listeners. To be able to think about when you see something like this, when you're doing code reviews on with your coworkers' code or staff or whoever, how can you actually try to take an example like this and bring it back out into the real world? And I don't know if it'd be worth the trouble of actually going and maybe finding an open call in your code, or if you're trying to do something with SNS and look at how you handle it. But that's always the interesting part here to me. It's like I'm happy to provide entertainment and make snarky jokes, but how can people actually bring this stuff back and make it useful in their own environment, I think is super important.
It is super important. I think we'll need you to keep harping on that because we have yet to implement RFC 3514, which would have made all of this type of security just much easier. So there's the Easter egg for our listeners. But you also set up, I think, a great segue into the NCC group published a public report on the security assessment they did for WhatsApp. And again, I pulled that out of interest and just seeing what was the, what is the protocol and encryption model behind something like WhatsApp, but also pull it out in that very spirit of what you were just saying. Here's how to learn from how other people create threat models, how other people communicate or conduct security assessments, because you might not be someone who's implementing end-to-end encryption, but you probably are handling keys somewhere. You might even be, depending on your environment, depending on your requirements, your compliance obligations, you might be interacting with HSMs. And so looking at a report like this, I think can be pretty informative from a couple different perspectives. In this case, there was nothing too earth-shattering, I would say, in terms of their findings that they pulled out, and I threw some. They're talking about opaque and some password authenticated key exchanges, which are really cool and basically ways of blinding the servers to what users' passwords are. So that's one of the ways to help protect secrets as well, user secrets. And I threw in just a link from a Cloudflare blog that's also talking about the opaque protocol and some of these other opaque protocols. So just kind of offer those up in the spirit of learning more about different schemes and how they might apply to your environment. And the one other thing that I'll highlight before I turn the mic back over to John once again, to making sure no trucks are going by, is this also talks about ceremonies. And the idea between ceremonies are a concept that actually came out of some Microsoft research that say you have protocols, but you also have people involved with protocols and people involved with the process, and they just kind of were using the term of art as a ceremony. And that's important when you're handling encryption keys, when you're interacting with things like HSMs or building trusted code, because you want to make sure that, and here we go with the bingo card, your supply chain or your end-to-end process of from code to deployment is a trusted chain of events. And this becomes extremely important for things like having confidence in end-to-end encryption. So a great, a neat security assessment, a great way just to perhaps broaden some of your threat models around encryption keys. How can attacks perhaps be targeted, and what to worry about when you're, for yourself, for your own environments, just dealing with encrypted data. So that's the broadened aspect there. I filibustered long enough, so hopefully traffic has died down, John. Let's hear what you have to say about this.
The trucks are gone. Everyone's awake. They've no point for them to make noise here anymore. Everyone's up. Yeah, so the first thing, what was interesting around this is if you look at the scope for this, it's very scoped. 5-phase, just to sort of go really quickly. Phase 1, end-to-end encrypted backups. That's all they're looking at in phase 1. Phase 2, as you said, is opaque. 3, HSM and key management. Nothing but a phase on that. And then 4 and 5 are retesting after it's a recheck. For those who don't know, usually when you do a pen test or some sort of a security test like this or an audit, you go through, do your work, give it to a customer. They go scratch their head. There's usually some big meeting with like everyone around the table. And then if in some cases they go off, do their work, come back and have you retest it. In other words, have they fixed the things you found? So that's 4 and 5 is looking at the results. So it's a 3-phase pen test, or excuse me, a 3-phased audit focused really on the encryption of WhatsApp that that 3 guys spent 35 person days on. That's a fairly expensive report for, let's be nice and say they're $1,000 a day. They're more than that, right? But these are NCC. These are some of the best guys out there. They're not cheap, even after price negotiation. But so the point being, this is a really interesting review to look at from that point of view, that you're actually seeing a security a product that's been designed for security or for privacy, after 3 guys went and poked around at it, what were they able to find? So to me, that's really interesting, right? You've got probably some of the best people on both sides of this working on this product. They're still able to find some issues. Most of them they've gone and taken care of. The low and info level ones, as usual. The WhatsApp guys said, yeah, we don't care about those. We're not going to deal with them, but everything else they fixed. So I think from that point of view, it's really interesting to go through and read this and actually see what could people find even after it was designed with that usage in mind. So in other words, the other way to look at this, there's always space for all of us to improve. But this is a good example of both of these guys do this stuff every day, day in, day out, and this is sort of what that type of thing looks like. So that's sort of cool.
It is cool. And I'm glad you mentioned too kind of the responses, because one of the other reasons I like to highlight reports like this or the blog post from earlier is good examples of communication and communicating security. And in this matter, I also wanted just to point out, the security isn't necessarily binary. A lot of things aren't binary, except the code that we're running on our CPUs, perhaps. In here, you see some of the reasoning behind why this is a high, medium, and low finding from NCC Group. And there's a table of responses to the findings. And this is just a good exercise to read through and say, this is a risk approach, saying that we deem this a risk that we want to fix, or we deem this an acceptable risk for these other reasons. And there might be mitigating controls. It might be our threat models are slightly different, or it might be that there are just other other restrictions why we can't follow through on a particular recommendation. So I think that's also really good to understand and learn, so that when we talk about checklists like the MVSP, we're not looking at the checklist just to say yes, 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 no, no, no. It's more of, have you paid attention to the context? Have you thought through the threat models behind it? And maybe some things just don't have to be fixed. So
and a quick comment in there. We had someone from Twitch, I guess, respond back with a WhatsApp security ? Don't use the app, easy. I personally agree with them. I've deleted WhatsApp off my phone. I'm working with enough people in Asia that I might actually put it back on with another username. But whether you agree with the policies behind, and that's not security, right? That's privacy. So 2 different things there. Right. I think WhatsApp does a great job with security. Privacy we'll leave for the guys on the other Security Weekly privacy show, because I'm just dodging that bullet. But yeah, that's some things we gotta keep in mind, right? It's one of the biggest issues we have with Facebook right now is they've done some really amazing work about what we cover week in, week out. React. Tools like WhatsApp. There's some really great stuff coming out of that place. So the question we all have to figure out is, like, how do you balance that, what they've done for open source and public security, with what they're doing with everything else? And I know
that's Yes, absolutely. And I know they've rebranded, but you've already been referring to them with 4-letter words. So, we'll skip the rebranding part. But to the point about just don't use it, I understand the sentiment. But one of the things I also want to caution us about is that who are the user base? How does that, who's being affected? And especially as you point out, WhatsApp has a huge penetration in Asia. So it's not only used for just staying connected to people, but can also be used quite a bit for payments. So you can't just say, okay, stop using this app and you have nothing else to replace it with. That's not to say things shouldn't be fixed. But when we look at this from that, call it the threat modeling perspective or security assessment, what are the alternatives? How do we still serve the user base rather than just come from an area of security purity? And that's, I think, the interesting conversations that can be had around here, that should be had around here. And that's also why I did even pull this week in another article about privacy engineering superheroes. But what this article is really about is the emerging role over the last several years of privacy engineering as a practice. And something that's quite distinct from security engineering or application security, which is what we love to talk about, of course, on ASW. It's in the name. But one of the things that stood out to me of this article is that it goes through some of the privacy engineering specialties. Basically, how do we understand what does privacy engineering even mean in a modern world? It's a type of thing that not many companies are doing right now. But a lot of these specialties like analysis and consulting, infrastructure, tooling and dashboards, user experience, those you could swap those out as security engineering specialties as well. So hopefully there is equal attention being placed on your security teams, and maybe this is also where you can help build where is a boundary to build up or a boundary to tear down between those AppSec and DevOps teams in terms of taking on these roles, especially building on top of that to say, what type of privacy policy do we have? What type of privacy practices do we have within our product so that it is actually serving our users well? And, to basically saying, are we selling a product to the users or offering a product to the users, or are the users the products themselves? Sort of or do we have a future of applications that are privacy friendly, or do we have a future of soil and green and the applications are made of people?
And that's one of the interesting things about this is when we talk about privacy, what actually is that, right? It's okay, we don't want to, we want to keep our PII safe for our customers or all these sort of different things. But really when it comes down to it, I think I like this list because it's from that point of view. It's like, these are the sort of the knobs you can play with to ensure privacy, right? These are sort of the parameters you can tweak and adjust based off your budget or based off what data you're protecting or who your customer is. And I like that they called out UX, user experience. That's a huge one to me in modern days. But I think that's this overall list. If you're sitting back thinking about, okay, we need to think about privacy in our product. What does that mean? Okay, well, we can do a privacy policy. That's easy. We'll go and copy that from someone else's website because that's what we do, or some of us. We will, especially if you're a startup. Okay, do we need some sort of tooling internally to actually our dashboards internally think about what type of privacy information we have from our users, how much of it out there? I really like the comment from Peter in the last half talking about not just logging, but logging the number of records returned. I think throwing that number by itself into a SIM, that sounds like you can do some sort of magical analytics and alerting on that, right? Suddenly, if like the number of records you're returning to a customer either spikes or drops to zero, pages should be going off. But I think that's what's interesting about this list. Sit back, think, which one of these things do you feel you're stronger or weaker in, or that you need to spend more time focusing on, or like me, the math and theory, you're just going to push that part completely aside and leave it for Mike.
But you just described a beautiful AI ML if statement there about the number of records coming back. So you've got that startup blood in you, I can tell, John. You've also got a great eye for breaking news and just kind of cool vulnerabilities, cool attacks out there. So there's another article you snuck in here called Trojan Source. I see there's Unicode in there, and handling characters is another dark art in UTF-8, and are they null terminated or whatnot. So no idea where this is taking us, but tell us what kind of ghosts are we going to find inside this article?
Yeah, first let's do our obligatory eye roll, another named vulnerability. So this one popped on my radar this morning. Hat tip to Brian Krebs and his awesome blog. I usually don't see this stuff that quickly, but this came out this morning after, I'm guessing, an embargo. So this is a fun one, Mike. I'll talk through the story, and then some interesting things I found when I was researching this morning. So what's going on here is there are nine characters in the Unicode set which allow controlling the direction of text. Is it left to right, right to left? So think about the one that comes to my mind is Chinese. I'm pretty sure is right to left. I'm not sure about the other ones, but I think that one comes to mind. If I'm right, I hope I'm right. But anyway, some languages out there they're read right to left. So when you're typing characters, you want the characters as you type them to go from the right edge of the screen across the left. We do this with comments. Usually you're writing those and you want to read those from left to right, or probably if you're in another language, you want those to go right to left. But what the underlying vulnerability here is, and they've got a really nice animation on the trojansource.codes page. I'll try to remember and paste this into Discord. But really what that means is there are certain situations where you can put a comment either at the beginning or end of a line, and it looks like the comment's there, but actually what it's commenting out can be changed, because what's rendering on the screen and what the compiler are actually chewing through can be different things. So in this use case, they've got a comment at the beginning of the line saying, hey, this line is for checking for admins, and then there's an if is admin after it. But then when they render it correctly, you realize that the if is admin is inside brackets or inside the comment, and you're actually running that code, which was only supposed to be run by admins. Simplistic, but that gets the idea across what's going on here. There's a white paper. Haven't had a chance to read it. I'm sure it goes in more detail what I just said. But what's the interesting thing about this? This is coming from University of Cambridge. What's interesting around this is, to our knowledge right now, this is the first vulnerability which is cross-programming language. So any language that has some sort of commenting capability in there and is able to, parse and use or accept Unicode characters, which are most nowadays, at least in the comments, you have the ability to do some hanky-panky stuff going on in here. I've got my word in from my bingo card. But so let's take a step back then, and what they did with this is they did a organized disclosure across a bunch of different languages. I saw this morning on OSS Security the announcement for Rust C, so I started looking at that one and how they were fixing it. And then they also have a mitigation in there. Is how I know they actually recommend mitigating out looking for these 9 different Unicodes in your source. And if you see those, there's a chance that something is going on in there. So so this could be fairly large from that. But what's interesting, as I was sort of teasing there, as I was looking around and I would go, hey, does Go have this yet? And there's no releases out this morning. I haven't checked in the last hour or two to see if they've got anything in the news about it or in anything they're publicly saying. But let's see, where did I put this? It is this one. Golang's ticket 20,209 issue from 2017 proposal: disallow left to right, right to left characters in string literals. So someone had been thinking about this earlier, which, if that's the case, makes me wonder if someone else has seen this and maybe gone a little bit further with this before the guys over at Cambridge. So prior art has been around for a while on this one. Maybe not in a comment, but at least in source code, people have been thinking about it. So that I think we might see some interesting news in the next week or two as a result of that.
Very, very cool. And I think the only thing I can add here is that hopefully this is something that can be addressed at the language or compiler level, let alone the IDEs, to be able to be more explicit about these changes in the bidirectional nature within a single line of text, so that this doesn't become, so it's basically, it's more scalable if you can get down to those particular parts of the tool chain, basically the building part, and hopefully this means it's a cool attack, but won't become so pervasive that's what's going to be on the OWASP 2024 top 10. And the only other thing I can add here is that it's taking advantage of the bidirectional, so I would have called this bad directional as my named vulnerability. So we can groan there, and you can send feedback about how poor my naming skills are off the cuff. But before you do that, do take a note. One last article, I was just highlighting the all-day DevOps, and haven't a ton of presentations, haven't had really a chance to go through there. I have a couple of them that were DevOps culture security related that I had marked to go watch after the fact. But listeners, if you have some favorite presentations from the All Day DevOps that was just last week, let us know, share, especially if there's something that you learned that was interesting, or there was a particular presentation that you'd want to highlight and amplify for our listeners to also take a look at. And with that, I think I'm out of news for the week. John, how do we feel here?
I'm the same way. I'm looking forward to our listeners crowdsourcing what we should be paying attention to there, and hopefully we'll talk about it next week.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you, John, for joining me. I want to thank everybody for hanging out in Discord and all of our listeners, because as John said, we hope you, you don't have to do all the work for us, but you do have to please come and listen, because we'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.